Picture this. It's a cold October morning in 1066. King Harold Godwinson stands on a hill near Hastings, blood streaming down his face, an arrow piercing his eye. Around him, the flower of English nobility lies scattered like fallen leaves. In the distance, Norman war horns echo across the battlefield. This is not just the death of a king. This is the death of an entire world. Tonight, you'll drift off to sleep while witnessing the rise and fall of kingdoms, the clash of mighty armies, and the stories of ordinary people who lived through extraordinary times. Close your eyes, and let me take you on a journey through 1,000 years of medieval England, where every whisper carries the weight of history, and every crown is stained with both glory and blood. When the last Roman legion marched away from Britain in 410 AD, they left behind more than just roads and walls. They left a vacuum that would be filled by legends. The mist rolls across the abandoned villas, and from the forests emerged tribes that would forge a new England. "We are the forgotten," an old Saxon warrior might have whispered to his grandson by the fire. "Rome called us barbarians, but we shall build something they never imagined." The Anglo-Saxons didn't arrive as conquerors. They came as invited guests. British kings, desperate to defend their lands from Pictish raids, hired Germanic mercenaries. But these warriors had tasted the sweet soil of Britain, felt the promise in its rivers and forests. Why return to their harsh homelands when paradise lay before them? Hengist and Horsa, the legendary Saxon brothers, stepped onto British shores around 449 AD. The chronicles tell us Horsa fell in battle, but Hengist lived to see his people claim the very lands they had come to defend. It was the oldest story in the world, the protector becoming the proprietor. Across the green hills of what would become England, 7 kingdoms emerged like flowers after winter: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, and Sussex. Each king believed himself chosen by the gods. Each warrior dreamed of eternal fame in the mead halls of his ancestors. But it was in the darkness of the 9th century that England found its first true hero. Picture a young prince named Alfred, barely in his 20s, watching Danish longships appear on the horizon like harbingers of doom. The great heathen army had come, led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, seeking vengeance for their father's death in a snake pit. "They burn our churches," Alfred's advisors whispered in terror. "They kill our priests. They care nothing for God or king." Alfred of Wessex could have fled. He could have joined the other English kings in submission or exile. Instead, he chose to fight from the marshes of Somerset, gathering the scattered remnants of English resistance like a shepherd collecting lost sheep. The Battle of Edington in 878 was more than just a military victory. It was the moment England was born. Alfred didn't just defeat Guthrum the Dane. He made him a Christian, made him a brother. The Danelaw was established, dividing England between Saxon and Viking. But for the first time, there was hope that these two warrior cultures could coexist. Alfred earned his title the Great, not just through conquest, but through creation. He built burhs, fortified towns that could withstand siege. He created a navy to match the Vikings on their own element. He translated Latin texts into English, believing that wisdom should belong to all his people, not just the learned few. "A king," Alfred wrote in his translation of Boethius, "must have 3 tools: a land well-peopled, prayermen and warmen, and workmen." He understood that a kingdom was built not just on swords, but on the hands and hearts of common folk. The 10th century saw Alfred's dream realized through his descendants: Edward the Elder, Ethelstan, Edgar the Peaceable. Each added their stone to the foundation of England. By the time of Edgar's coronation at Bath in 973, he was not just king of the West Saxons, but emperor of all Britain. Welsh princes and Scottish kings rowed his royal barge down the River Dee, acknowledging his supremacy. But paradise never lasts. Edgar died young, and his death unleashed a succession crisis that would echo through the centuries. His son Edward, barely 16, was murdered at Corfe Castle by supporters of his half-brother Ethelred. The martyrdom of Edward the Martyr in 978 was an omen of darker days to come. Ethelred II, forever cursed with the nickname the Unready, which actually meant poorly advised, inherited a kingdom on the brink of chaos. The Vikings returned, no longer raiders but conquerors. Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark didn't want tribute. He wanted the throne itself. On St. Brice's Day, November 13, 1002, Ethelred made a decision that would haunt England for decades. He ordered the massacre of all Danes living in his kingdom. Among the dead was Gunhilda, sister of the Danish king Svein. She was burned alive in a church. Her final words a curse upon the English throne. "You have awakened a dragon that will devour your kingdom," she reportedly cried as the flames consumed her. And so it came to pass. Svein invaded with vengeance in his heart. By 1013, Ethelred fled to Normandy and Svein Forkbeard was acknowledged as King of England. But Svein died within months, leaving his teenage son Cnut to hold together a conquest built on rage. Cnut the Great proved to be one of England's wisest rulers, though few remember him as such. He married Ethelred's widow, Emma of Normandy, binding Danish and English bloodlines. He built churches, patronized monasteries, and governed with a light touch that made his subjects forget they lived under foreign rule. The famous story of Cnut and the waves was not about his arrogance, but his wisdom. When his flattering courtiers claimed he could command even the sea, he sat on his throne at the water's edge and let the tide soak his royal robes. "Let all the world know," he declared, "that the power of kings is empty save for God, to whom alone belong heaven, earth and sea." Cnut died in 1035, and with him died the dream of a North Sea empire. His sons were weak, his kingdom divided. The English nobility, led by the powerful Earl Godwin of Wessex, invited Edward the Confessor, Ethelred's son, back from Norman exile. Edward was more monk than king, more interested in building Westminster Abbey than building armies. He died childless in January 1066, setting the stage for the greatest crisis in English history. 3 men claimed his throne: Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex and the most powerful man in England; William, Duke of Normandy, who claimed Edward had promised him the crown; and Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, who based his claim on ancient agreements between his ancestors and Cnut. Harold Godwinson was crowned within hours of Edward's death, but crowns won easily are held with difficulty. In September 1066, Harold Hardrada landed in Yorkshire with 300 ships and 8,000 warriors. This was the last great Viking invasion, led by the man they called the Thunderbolt of the North. At Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066, Harold Godwinson achieved what might have been the greatest victory in English history. Harold Hardrada was killed by an English arrow, his massive army destroyed. The Viking Age died with him on that Yorkshire field, but victory has its price. Harold's army was exhausted, many of his best warriors dead, and far to the south, Norman ships were appearing off the Sussex coast. William the Bastard, for he was born illegitimate, though none dared call him that to his face, had spent months preparing for this moment. He claimed not just Edward's promise, but Harold's own oath, sworn over holy relics, to support his claim to the throne. The 2 armies met at Senlac Hill near Hastings on October 14, 1066. From dawn to dusk they fought, Norman cavalry charging again and again against the Saxon shield wall. Harold's brothers fell, Gurth and Leofwine dying beside their king's banner. Still the Saxons held. Then as the sun began to set, Harold Godwinson fell. Whether struck by an arrow in the eye or hacked down by Norman swords, no one can say for certain. What matters is that with his death, Saxon England died too. William found Harold's body on the battlefield, identified by his mistress Edith Swanneck from marks known only to her. He gave the last Saxon king a proper burial, understanding that even conquerors must show respect to the conquered. That night, as Norman soldiers counted their dead and Saxon survivors fled into the darkness, England crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. Christmas Day, 1066. Westminster Abbey stands silent except for the shuffling of feet and the whispered prayers of frightened witnesses. William, Duke of Normandy, waits to be crowned King of England, but the ceremony nearly ends in disaster when Norman soldiers mistake the Saxon. Congregations cheers for an uprising and begin burning houses around the abbey. Even God seems uncertain of this coronation. An English priest might have whispered, watching smoke seep through the abbey windows. But William was not a man to be deterred by omens. He had conquered England in a single battle, but holding it would take 20 years of iron-fisted rule that would reshape every aspect of English life. The Normans brought more than just new lords. They brought a new world. Where Saxon kings had ruled through personal relationships and ancient custom, William introduced the rigid hierarchies of continental feudalism. Every acre of England was now held directly or indirectly from the king. There were no more independent lordships, no more ancient freedoms that preceded royal authority. The harrying of the north in 1069-70 revealed the steel beneath William's royal robes. When Yorkshire rebelled, supported by a Danish fleet, William's response was systematic devastation. From York to Durham, his armies burned every village, slaughtered every animal, salted every field. Chroniclers claim that for 9 years no village smoked between York and Durham, a desert where once had been the Garden of England. "I have made the north a wilderness," William reportedly said, and on his deathbed he wept for this sin. But William was more than just a conqueror. He was a bureaucrat of genius. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, was the most comprehensive survey of land ownership ever attempted in medieval Europe. Every hide of land, every plow team, every mill was recorded with meticulous detail. There was not a single hide of land in England that he did not know who owned it, marveled the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and what it was worth. When William died in 1087 from injuries sustained falling from his horse during a siege, he left behind a transformed England. His body was so swollen that it burst during his funeral, filling the church with such stench that mourners fled in disgust. Even in death, the Conqueror commanded attention. His eldest son Robert inherited Normandy. His second son William Rufus took England, and his youngest, Henry, received silver that he would turn into a crown. The division of William's empire set his sons against each other in wars that would define the next century. William Rufus, called Rufus, for his red hair and florid complexion, was everything his father was not. Where William the Conqueror was calculating and methodical, Rufus was impulsive and flamboyant. He never married, leading to whispered rumors about his sexuality. He mocked the church, once declaring he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. "By God's face," was his favorite oath, considered scandalous blasphemy by his contemporaries. His death in the New Forest in 1100 remains one of history's great mysteries. The official story says he was accidentally shot by Walter Tyrrell during a hunting expedition. But Tyrrell fled immediately to France, and Rufus's younger brother Henry was remarkably well prepared to seize power within hours of the king's death. Henry I, the youngest son who inherited nothing but silver, became the most successful of William's heirs. Educated in the new cathedral schools, he could read and write in 3 languages, earning him the nickname Beauclerc, or good scholar. But his greatest skill was in statecraft. Henry understood that Norman rule depended on English acceptance. He married Edith, daughter of Malcolm III of Scotland and descendant of the Old English royal house. When the Norman nobility sneered at their English queen, Henry replied that his sons would have English as well as Norman blood, uniting the conquest and the conquered in their veins. The White Ship disaster of 1120 shattered Henry's dynastic dreams. His only legitimate son, William Etheling, was among the 300 souls who drowned when the newest, fastest ship in the royal fleet struck a rock off the Norman coast. Only one man survived to tell the tale. No ship that ever sailed brought such misery to England, wrote chronicler William of Malmesbury. Henry's response was to make his daughter Matilda his heir, the first woman to be designated successor to the English throne. He forced his barons to swear loyalty to her, but oaths sworn to a living king often died with him. When Henry died in 1135 from a surfeit of lampreys, though poison was whispered, his nephew, Stephen of Blois, moved faster than Matilda could react. Stephen was charming, generous, and brave in battle. He was also catastrophically weak as a king. The anarchy, as the civil war between Stephen and Matilda came to be known, lasted 19 years and nearly destroyed the kingdom William had built. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle captured the horror. They said openly that Christ and his saints were asleep. In this breakdown of royal authority, local lords became petty tyrants. They built unlicensed castles, raised private armies, and terrorized the countryside. Geoffrey de Mandeville turned the Isle of Ely into a brigand's kingdom. The Earl of Chester and the Earl of Lincoln fought a private war that devastated the Midlands. But from this chaos emerged one of the most remarkable women in medieval history. Matilda, called Domina Anglorum, Lady of the English, proved that she inherited her grandfather's iron will, along with his crown. When captured at Arundel, she negotiated her own release. When besieged at Oxford Castle, she escaped across the frozen Thames dressed in white robes that made her invisible against the snow. Her finest hour came at Winchester in 1141, when she briefly held Stephen prisoner and came within a whisper of being crowned England's first queen regnant. But her haughty manner, she was, after all, a Holy Roman Empress, alienated the London citizens who might have supported her. She carried herself like Caesar, complained one chronicler, as if this were a fault rather than a necessity for survival. By 1153, both sides were exhausted. Stephen had lost his beloved son Eustace. Matilda had withdrawn to Normandy. The Treaty of Wallingford ended the war with a compromise that satisfied no one and everyone. Stephen would remain king, but Matilda's son Henry would inherit the throne. Henry Fitz-Empress, later Henry II, was 21 when he became king in 1154. Tall, red-haired, with the boundless energy that would define the Plantagenet dynasty, he inherited an empire that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. But first, he had to rebuild a kingdom that had nearly torn itself apart. The anarchy was over. The Plantagenet age was about to begin. Henry II paced the floor of his royal chamber like a caged lion, his famous temper rising with each word from his advisors. Outside, rain lashed against the windows of his palace, but inside, a different storm was brewing. "Will no one rid me of this troublesome priest?" 4 words that would echo through history. 4 words that would transform an archbishop into a martyr and a king into a penitent. The year was 1170, and Henry II, master of an empire that stretched from Scotland to Spain, was about to learn that some enemies are more dangerous dead than alive. When Henry inherited the throne in 1154, England was a broken kingdom. The 19-year civil war between Stephen and Matilda had left the realm scarred by unlicensed castles, private armies, and the rule of the sword. But Henry Fitz-Empress was no ordinary king, grandson of Henry I through his mother Matilda, heir to Geoffrey Plantagenet of Anjou through his father, husband to Eleanor of Aquitaine. The most powerful woman in Europe, he commanded resources that dwarfed any previous English monarch. "God gave him everything," marveled a contemporary chronicler. "Lands, wisdom, eloquence, fame in arms, everything but the ability to rest." And indeed, Henry could never rest. He held court on horseback, racing from England to Normandy to Anjou to Aquitaine, covering distances that amazed his exhausted courtiers. His empire was too vast to rule from any single throne room. It demanded a king who could be everywhere at once. Henry's first task was to tame the anarchy that had consumed England for a generation. He razed over 1,000 unlicensed castles, forcing proud barons to surrender strongholds they had considered their birthright. The mercenaries who had turned warfare into a profitable enterprise found themselves suddenly unemployed, shipped back to the continent with stern warnings never to return. But Henry's greatest innovation was legal, not military. The constitutions of Clarendon in 1164 established royal courts with jurisdiction over cases that had previously been settled by local lords or church officials. Henry's traveling justices carried the king's law to every corner of the realm, creating a common law that would outlast every dynasty and eventually spread across the world. It was this legal revolution that brought Henry into conflict with Thomas Becket, his former chancellor and closest friend. Henry had elevated Becket from a London merchant's son to Archbishop of Canterbury, expecting gratitude and compliance. Instead, he found opposition more determined than any he had faced from rebel barons. "You have raised me high," Becket told the king when he accepted the archbishopric. "But remember that I must serve God before I serve you." The friendship that had once been the wonder of Europe curdled into a hatred that scandalized Christendom. Henry wanted church courts to surrender jurisdiction over criminal clergy. Priests who committed murder or theft should face royal justice, not merely ecclesiastical penance. Becket saw this as an attack on the church's ancient liberties. Their quarrel played out across Europe. Becket fled to France, where he lived in exile for 6 years, hurling excommunications at Henry's supporters like thunderbolts from heaven. Henry retaliated by confiscating church property and threatening to break with Rome entirely, an act that would not be repeated until Henry VIII 3.5 centuries later. In 1170, they attempted reconciliation. Becket returned to Canterbury, greeted by cheering crowds who saw him as a defender of religious liberty against royal tyranny. But within days, he had excommunicated the Archbishop of York and several bishops who had participated in crowning Henry's son during his exile. When news reached Henry, then holding court in Normandy, his legendary temper exploded. The exact words he spoke remain disputed. Perhaps it was troublesome priest, perhaps turbulent priest, perhaps something far more profane. But 4 knights heard their king's rage and understood it as a command. On December 29, 1170, as Vespers bells rang across Canterbury, Reginald Fitzurse, William de Crécy, Hugh de Morville, and Richard le Breton entered Canterbury Cathedral in full armor. They found Becket by the altar of St. Benedict, unguarded and unafraid. "Where is Thomas Becket, traitor to king and kingdom?" they demanded. "Here I am," Becket replied, "a priest of God. What do you want?" The first blow came from de Crécy's sword, slicing off the crown of Becket's head. The second, from Fitzurse, sent him sprawling across the cathedral stones. The third, from Le Breton, scattered his brains across the pavement, breaking the sword blade on the stone floor. Within hours, miracles were reported at Becket's tomb. Within months, he was venerated as a martyr throughout Europe. Within 3 years, he was canonized as St. Thomas of Canterbury, the fastest canonization in medieval history. Henry's reaction was one of genuine horror. Whatever his words had meant, he had never intended murder in a cathedral, sacrilege that threatened his very soul. In 1174, he walked barefoot through the streets of Canterbury to Becket's tomb, where he knelt before the monks and allowed each to strike him 5 times with a rod. "I submit to this penance willingly," Henry declared, "for I am responsible for this man's death, though not by my intention." But even as Henry performed public penance, his empire was crumbling from within. His 4 sons, young Henry, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, formed a pack of royal wolves, each scheming for a larger share of their father's dominions. Eleanor of Aquitaine, their mother, had turned against her husband, encouraging their rebellions from her court in Poitiers. The Great Revolt of 1173–74 saw 3 of Henry's sons allied with the King of France, the King of Scotland, and rebel barons across the Plantagenet domains. For a terrifying moment, it seemed the empire might fragment as quickly as it had been assembled. But Henry's genius for war matched his talent for government. He moved with lightning speed from crisis to crisis, relieving besieged castles, routing rebel armies, capturing the King of Scotland in a dawn raid. By 1174, the revolt had collapsed, and Henry's sons were begging forgiveness on their knees. Young Henry, the heir apparent, died of dysentery in 1183 while raiding monasteries to pay his mercenaries, a death his contemporaries saw as divine judgment. Geoffrey, Duke of Brittany, was trampled by horses at a tournament in 1186. Eleanor was kept under comfortable but strict house arrest, her political influence neutralized. This left Richard, called Lionheart for his prowess in battle, and John, the youngest son who would inherit the crown but lose the empire. Henry II died in 1189 at Chinon Castle, abandoned by his sons and many of his vassals. His last words reportedly were, "Shame, shame on a conquered king," but he had not been conquered by external enemies. He had been destroyed by the sons he loved and the wife he could never quite tame. Richard, I cared nothing for England except as a source of money for his crusades. He spent less than a year of his 10-year reign in the country and spoke French as his native tongue. Yet somehow, he became the most popular king in English legend, the absent hero whose very absence allowed him to remain forever noble. "If I could find a buyer, I would sell London itself," Richard declared when raising money for the Third Crusade. And indeed, he sold everything sellable: offices, castles, towns, even the kingdom's claim to overlordship of Scotland. England was milked dry to fund Richard's obsession with recovering Jerusalem from Saladin. But what a glorious failure it was. Richard's exploits in the Holy Land passed immediately into legend. His victories at Arsuf and Jaffa, his chivalrous exchanges with Saladin, his dramatic rescue of the fortress of Jaffa by wading ashore with sword in hand. These stories would inspire crusading ballads for centuries. The Third Crusade failed to recapture Jerusalem, but it established Richard as the greatest warrior of his age. Even Saladin, his nemesis, praised the English king's courage and courtesy. "Your king," Saladin told Richard's envoys, "is the greatest knight in Christendom." Richard's journey home became an epic in itself. Shipwrecked in the Adriatic, he attempted to cross Europe in disguise, only to be captured by Duke Leopold of Austria, whom he had insulted during the siege of Acre. For 2 years, Richard languished in German prisons while England bled to pay his ransom of 150,000 marks, equivalent to 3 years' royal revenue. His brother John, left as regent, proved himself spectacularly unfit for power. He attempted to seize the throne, claiming Richard was dead, and allied with Philip Augustus of France to partition the Plantagenet domains. Only the loyalty of Hubert Walter, Archbishop of Canterbury, and William Marshal, the greatest knight of the age, kept England from sliding into civil war. When Richard returned in 1194, he forgave John with characteristic magnanimity. "He is my brother," he said, and was led astray by evil counselors. But the damage was done. Philip Augustus had seized key Norman fortresses, and the French king's long campaign to destroy the Plantagenet Empire was bearing fruit. Richard spent his final 5 years in constant warfare, trying to recover what John had lost. He was building the greatest castle of the age, Chateau Gaillard. His saucy castle, where to guard the way, approaches to Rouen when a stray crossbow bolt ended. His life at the siege of Chalus-Chabrol in 1199, the bolt struck Richard in the shoulder, a minor wound that should have healed easily. But infection set in, and the Lionheart died in agony, characteristically forgiving the boy who had shot him and ordering that he be set free with a gift of money. With Richard's death, the Plantagenet Empire passed to John, the man chroniclers would call Soft Sword and Lackland, the king who would lose more territory than any monarch in English history. John's reign began with a succession crisis. Many barons preferred his nephew Arthur of Brittany, son of the late Geoffrey. John's solution was characteristically brutal. Arthur disappeared into a Norman dungeon in 1203 and was never seen again. Rumors that John had murdered his nephew with his own hands would haunt the rest of his reign. Philip Augustus seized this opportunity with both hands. Declaring John an unfit vassal, he invaded Normandy in 1203. John's response was to flee to England, abandoning his continental subjects to French conquest. By 1204, Normandy was lost. Anjou followed in 1205. By 1206, the Plantagenet Empire had shrunk to England, parts of Ireland, and a precarious foothold in southwestern France. The Norman conquest was being undone, 140 years after Hastings. John's attempts to recover his lost inheritance bankrupted England and drove his barons to the edge of rebellion. His quarrel with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury resulted in England being placed under interdict from 1208 to 1213. No masses, no marriages, no Christian burials. John was excommunicated, and Innocent declared his throne forfeit. "Let them ring their bells," John sneered when the interdict began. "I care nothing for their noise." But the isolation was crushing. When Philip Augustus prepared to invade England with papal blessing in 1213, John was forced into humiliating surrender. He accepted Langton as archbishop, compensated the church for its losses, and, most galling of all, accepted England as a papal fief, paying annual tribute to Rome. John's final gamble was the campaign of 1214, when he allied with Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV and the Count of Flanders to attack France from both east and west. The strategy was sound, but John's part of the plan collapsed at the Battle of Bouvines, where Philip Augustus won the most decisive victory in medieval European history. With the loss at Bouvines, John's last hope of recovering his inheritance died. The barons who had followed him to France returned home in fury, demanding that he honor the laws and customs his ancestors had established. When John refused, civil war became inevitable. On a marshy island in the Thames called Runnymede, on June 15, 1215, the most important legal document in English history was sealed with the royal seal. Magna Carta, the Great Charter, was not intended as a democratic manifesto. It was a feudal contract, designed to limit royal power and protect baronial privileges, but its principles would echo through the centuries. The king is not above the law. Taxation requires consent. Justice cannot be sold or denied. To no one will we sell. To no one will we refuse or delay right or justice, declared Clause 40. Words that would inspire legal systems across the world. John had no intention of honoring the charter he had been forced to seal. Within months, he had persuaded Pope Innocent III to declare it invalid, and England was once again at war with itself. John died at Newark Castle in October 1216, aged 49, his body racked by dysentery and his kingdom torn by civil war. His last act was to entrust his 9-year-old son Henry to the care of William Marshal, the aged knight who had served 4 kings with unwavering loyalty. "Sir Marshal," John gasped with his dying breath, "I entrust to God and to you my sons and my kingdom." The Plantagenet Empire was gone, but the Plantagenet dynasty would endure. The boy who would become Henry III inherited a kingdom in ruins, but also a charter that would outlive every throne and crown. 9-year-old Henry III stood in Gloucester Cathedral on October 28, 1216. As the Bishop of Worcester placed a simple gold circlet on his head, the royal crown was locked away in rebel-held London. Around him, fewer than a dozen barons knelt in homage, while across the realm, French armies occupied the capital and rebel lords controlled half the kingdom. It was the darkest hour in the history of the English monarchy. Yet from this moment of utter defeat would emerge one of the longest and most transformative reigns in medieval history. "God has given us this child to be our king," declared William Marshal, the 70-year-old knight who had served 4 kings and now became regent for a 5th. "By God's sword we shall see him crowned in Westminster or die in the attempt." Marshal understood what many did not, that a boy king might succeed where his father had failed. John Lackland had been hated as a tyrant and feared as a kinslayer, but young Henry was innocent of his father's crimes. The barons who had invited Prince Louis of France to take the throne began to reconsider their allegiance. The civil war that followed was as much about English identity as royal authority. Louis of France represented foreign rule, backed by foreign armies. Henry, though only a child, embodied the legitimate succession that stretched back to the Norman Conquest and beyond. The tide turned at the Battle of Lincoln in May 1217, where Marshal, ancient but still formidable, led a cavalry charge that shattered the rebel army. The townspeople of Lincoln joined the battle, pelting the French with stones from their windows while shouting, "God and the Marshal!" Louis's cause collapsed when his supply fleet was destroyed at the Battle of Sandwich by Hubert de Burgh, the justiciar who had held Dover Castle against overwhelming odds for months. The French ships were caught in the narrow straits, their high castles perfect targets for English crossbowmen. "The sea itself fights for England," declared the sailor monk who commanded the English fleet, as French ships burned on the waves. By September 1217, Louis had abandoned his claim to the English throne and sailed back to France with the remnant of his forces. The First Barons' War was over, won not by a king, but by a council of regents who understood that legitimate monarchy was England's best defense against chaos. Young Henry was crowned again at Westminster in 1220, this time with the proper ceremony and regalia. But the real power remained with his advisors, first William Marshal until his death in 1219, then Hubert de Burgh, who would serve as justiciar for the next 15 years. These were England's greatest years of medieval prosperity and peace. Trade flourished, towns grew, the population expanded. The wool trade with Flanders made England rich, while innovations in agriculture, the heavy plow, crop rotation, water mills, increased productivity beyond anything previously imagined. But Henry III was not content to be a figurehead king. As he came of age, he chafed against the constraints imposed by his council. He dreamed of recovering his father's lost inheritance, of rebuilding the Plantagenet empire that had once stretched from Scotland to Spain. In 1227, he declared himself of age and dismissed Hubert de Burgh, beginning a personal rule that would last for nearly 50 years. Henry was intelligent, cultured, deeply religious, and catastrophically impractical as a king. His first great mistake was his marriage to Eleanor of Provence in 1236. Eleanor was beautiful, intelligent, and well-connected. Her sister would become Queen of France. But she brought with her a swarm of Provençal relatives who expected English lands and titles as their birthright. "The king's uncle-in-law now holds more land than most earls," complained the barons, watching Henry shower gifts on Eleanor's family. Even worse were the Poitevin half-brothers of Henry's mother, the Lusignans, who arrived in England in 1247, expecting immediate elevation to the highest ranks of the nobility. Henry granted them vast estates and arranged magnificent marriages, effectively creating a new aristocracy that displaced the families who had served the crown for generations. The baronial resentment exploded in 1258, when Henry's latest scheme, accepting the Sicilian crown for his second son Edmund from Pope Alexander IV, threatened to bankrupt the kingdom. The Pope demanded 135,000 marks for the privilege, and excommunication if Henry failed to pay. "The king asks us to pay for a kingdom that exists only in the Pope's imagination," declared Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, who had once been Henry's closest friend, and was now his most dangerous enemy. The mad Parliament of 1258 forced Henry to accept a revolutionary system of government. 24 barons would choose 15 members of a council that would control royal policy. The king could make no important decisions without their consent. It was constitutional monarchy enforced at sword point. Henry accepted the provisions of Oxford because he had no choice, but he never intended to honor them. In 1261, he secured papal absolution from his oath and began gathering foreign mercenaries to restore his authority. The Second Barons. War that followed was more than a feudal rebellion. It was England's first experiment with parliamentary government. Simon de Montfort, the French-born earl who led the baronial opposition, summoned representatives not just from the nobility and clergy, but from the towns and shires. For the first time in English history, knights and burgesses sat alongside earls and bishops to discuss the realm's affairs. "What touches all should be approved by all," de Montfort declared, invoking a principle that would echo through the centuries. The war's decisive moment came at Lewes in May 1264, where de Montfort's tactical genius overcame Henry's superior numbers. The king's brother Richard of Cornwall was captured hiding in a windmill, while Prince Edward, the future Edward I, was taken prisoner despite his fierce resistance. For 15 months, Simon de Montfort ruled England in everything but name. His Parliament of 1265 included not just 2 knights from each shire, but 2 burgesses from each major town, the first truly representative assembly in European history. But de Montfort's revolution contained the seeds of its own destruction. His alliance with Llewellyn ap Gruffudd of Wales alienated English sentiment, while his harsh treatment of the Jewish community, he expelled all Jews from Leicester and allowed massacres in other cities, showed the dark side of popular government. Prince Edward escaped from captivity in May 1265 and quickly gathered the royalist forces. At Evesham in August, de Montfort faced an army twice the size of his own, led by a prince who had learned military tactics during his captivity. "Let us commend our souls to God," de Montfort told his men as the royalist forces closed in, "for our bodies are theirs." The Battle of Evesham was less a battle than a massacre. De Montfort was hacked to pieces, his head sent to the wife of a royalist baron as a trophy. His hands and feet were cut off and distributed as grisly souvenirs. Even in an age accustomed to violence, the mutilation of his corpse shocked contemporaries. But de Montfort's ideas outlived his body. The principle that kings should govern with the consent of the governed had been established. Parliament, the word itself derived from the French parler, to speak, would meet regularly throughout the remainder of Henry's reign. Henry III lived another 7 years after Evesham, but real power had passed to his son Edward. The prince who had learned statecraft as de Montfort's prisoner became the regent who prepared for his own kingship with methodical care. When Henry died in November 1272, Edward was in the Holy Land, leading England's last serious crusade. The news took months to reach him, but there was no succession crisis. For the first time since the Norman Conquest, the crown passed peacefully from father to son. "The king is dead," announced the royal council. "Long live the king." Edward I returned from crusade in 1274 as the most formidable warrior king since Richard Lionheart. But where Richard had pursued glory in foreign lands, Edward focused his ambitions on the British Isles themselves. His reign would see the conquest of Wales, the near conquest of Scotland, and the establishment of English power from Carlisle to Caernarfon. Wales had remained independent since the Roman withdrawal, its princes ruling mountain kingdoms that even the Normans had failed to fully subdue. But by 1272, Llewellyn ap Gruffudd had united most of Wales under his authority and claimed the title Prince of Wales by right of conquest. Edward's response was methodical and overwhelming. In 1277, he invaded Wales with the largest army assembled by an English king since the Norman Conquest. But this was more than military conquest. It was systematic colonization. Edward built a ring of massive stone castles around the Welsh heartland: Flint, Rhuddlan, Builth, Aberystwyth, and later Caernarfon, Conwy, and Harlech. These were not just fortresses, but centers of English administration, each surrounded by a planned town populated by English settlers. "These castles are the keys to Wales," Edward declared, "and I shall hold every key." The Welsh submitted in 1277, but their resentment simmered beneath the surface. In 1282, Llewellyn's brother Dafydd launched a desperate rebellion, burning English settlements and massacring colonists. Llewellyn joined the revolt, but it was hopeless against Edward's war machine. At Orwen Bridge in December 1282, Llewellyn ap Gruffudd was killed in a skirmish so minor that the English didn't realize they had slain the last Prince of Wales until they found his body. His head was cut off and displayed at the Tower of London, crowned with ivy in mockery of ancient prophecies. With Llewellyn's death, Welsh independence died too. Edward's son, the future Edward II, was born at Caernarfon Castle and given the title Prince of Wales, a tradition that continues to this day. But Edward's greatest challenge lay to the north. Scotland had been England's ally and vassal since the reign of William the Lion, but the death of Alexander III in 1286 left the succession in dispute, when the legitimate heir, Alexander's granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway, died en route to Scotland in 1290. 13 different claimants emerged. The Scots invited Edward to arbitrate, recognizing him as overlord of Scotland. His choice of John Balliol over Robert Bruce seemed judicious. Balliol had the strongest legal claim, but Edward treated the King of Scotland as a mere vassal, summoning him to Westminster for minor disputes and demanding Scottish military service in his wars with France. "Am I nothing but a bailiff?" Balliol reportedly complained to his advisors. In 1295, the Scots had endured enough. They formed an alliance with Philip IV of France, the beginning of the Auld Alliance that would bedevil English foreign policy for centuries. When Edward demanded military service for his French war, the Scots refused and prepared for invasion. Edward's response was swift and terrible. In 1296, his army stormed Berwick, Scotland's greatest port, and massacred its inhabitants without mercy. Contemporary accounts claim 17,000 dead, though the town's total population was probably less than 10,000. "I shall make Scotland a desert," Edward vowed, echoing his grandfather's harrying of the north. The Scottish army was crushed at Dunbar. King John Balliol was deposed and humiliated, and the Stone of Scone, symbol of Scottish kingship, was carried south to Westminster Abbey. Scotland seemed as thoroughly conquered as Wales, but conquest and pacification were different things. In 1297, William Wallace, a younger son of a minor Renfrewshire landowner, raised the banner of Scottish independence. His victory over an English army at Stirling Bridge sent shockwaves through Europe. Wallace's tactics at Stirling Bridge showed genius bordering on madness. He allowed half the English army to cross the narrow bridge, then struck with spearmen who drove the survivors into the river. The Earl of Surrey, Edward's veteran commander, could only watch from the far bank as his forces were annihilated. "The English flee like hares before the hounds," exulted Scottish chroniclers. But Wallace's triumph was brief. Edward returned from Flanders and crushed the Scottish army at Falkirk in 1298, using Welsh longbowmen to break the Scottish schiltrons before his heavy cavalry delivered the killing blow. Wallace escaped but spent the rest of his life as a fugitive. When finally captured in 1305, he was taken to London and executed with the full barbarity reserved for traitors. Hanged, drawn, and quartered. His head displayed on London Bridge and his limbs sent to Scotland as a warning. Yet even Wallace's gruesome death could not end Scottish resistance. In 1306, Robert Bruce, grandson of Edward's rejected claimant, seized the Scottish throne and began the guerrilla war that would ultimately drive the English from Scotland. Bruce's early career was hardly inspiring. He murdered John Comyn, his rival, in a church at Dumfries, an act of sacrilege that earned him excommunication. His coronation at Scone was attended by only a handful of supporters, and within months he was a fugitive hiding in the hills. The famous story of Bruce and the spider, watching the creature's persistent efforts to spin its web in a cave, may be legend, but it captures the essence of his struggle. Defeat followed defeat, yet Bruce never surrendered. Edward III died in July 1307 while marching north for another Scottish campaign. His last words were reportedly a command that his body be boiled and his bones carried at the head of every English army until Scotland was conquered. Hammer of the Scots was carved on his tomb, but the hammer had failed to break Scottish resistance. His son Edward II was everything his father was not. Where Edward I was a warrior, Edward II was a aesthete. Where the father commanded respect through fear, the son inspired only contempt. His relationship with Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight of minor nobility, scandalized the court and provided his enemies with a weapon they would wield ruthlessly. "The king loves Gaveston more than his kingdom," complained the earls, who saw their own influence eclipsed by a foreign favorite. Edward II's infatuation with Gaveston was probably sexual, though medieval chroniclers veiled their meaning in careful euphemisms. What mattered was not the nature of their relationship, but its political consequences. Gaveston was elevated to the earldom of Cornwall, traditionally reserved for members of the royal family and given precedence over earls whose ancestors had come over with the Conqueror. The baronial opposition, led by Edward's cousin Thomas of Lancaster, forced Gaveston into exile twice, but Edward always brought him back. In 1312, the earls took matters into their own hands. They captured Gaveston and executed him without trial, leaving his body on the road for Edward to find. Edward II never forgave or forgot. His desire for revenge against Lancaster and the other ordainers would poison the rest of his reign. But first, he had to deal with Robert Bruce, who had used the years of English civil strife to reconquer most of Scotland. By 1314, only Stirling Castle remained in English hands north of the border. Edward II gathered the largest army ever to invade Scotland, perhaps 25,000 men, including the flower of English chivalry. Bruce had barely 7,000 warriors, mostly spearmen fighting on foot. The Battle of Bannockburn, fought over 2 days in June 1314, was the greatest military disaster in English history until the fall of Singapore. Edward's heavy cavalry, so effective against Welsh spearmen and French knights, proved helpless against Scottish schiltrons fighting in carefully chosen ground. The sight of the English king fleeing the battlefield, abandoning his seal, his shield and his honor, completed Scotland's moral victory. Edward II would never again be taken seriously as a military commander. God, what a sorry sight, to see so rich a king take flight so ignominiously, mocked Scottish poet John Barber. Bannockburn secured Scottish independence, but it also doomed Edward II. A king who could not defend his realm's borders had forfeited the respect essential to medieval kingship. The barons who had murdered Gaveston now turned their attention to destroying the king himself. Thomas of Lancaster, armed with the ordinances that restricted royal power, effectively ruled England from 1314 to 1318. But Lancaster was better at opposition than government. While he quarreled with Edward II, Scottish raiders devastated northern England with impunity, burning towns and levying tribute as far south as Yorkshire. Edward's attempt to overthrow Lancaster's rule led to civil war in 1321-22. This time, the king's new favorites, Hugh Despencer the Elder and his son Hugh the Younger, provided more competent leadership than poor Gaveston had managed. At Boroughbridge in March 1322, Lancaster was defeated and captured. The execution of Thomas of Lancaster was Edward II's greatest political mistake. Lancaster may have been a poor ruler, but he was the king's cousin and the greatest earl in England. His judicial murder, for it was nothing else, created a martyr and guaranteed that Edward would face further rebellions. Indeed, Lancaster's memory became a rallying point for opposition to royal tyranny. Miracles were reported at his tomb, and he was venerated as a saint by the common people who had suffered from his misgovernment, but remembered only his resistance to the Despensers. The Despensers' rapacity made Gaveston look modest by comparison. They seized lands throughout Wales and the Welsh March, using their control of the king to settle private scores and accumulate vast estates. Their greed eventually united the entire political nation against them. The end came in 1326, when Edward's neglected queen, Isabella of France, invaded England with her lover Roger Mortimer and a handful of foreign mercenaries. The kingdom that had seemed secure under Despencer control collapsed within weeks. The whole realm rose against the king, recorded one chronicler, as if they had been waiting for this moment. Edward II was captured and forced to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son, Edward III, on September 21, 1327. The deposed king died at Berkeley Castle under circumstances that remain mysterious. The official cause was natural illness, but rumors of murder, specifically, a red-hot poker thrust into his bowels, spread immediately and have never been convincingly refuted. With Edward II's death, the direct Plantagenet line ended. His son Edward III would found a new royal house and launch England on the path to European dominance. But first, the realm had to recover from 70 years of civil war, military disaster, and royal incompetence. The boy king who inherited this troubled legacy would prove that the blood of Edward IV still flowed in Plantagenet veins. 14-year-old Edward III stood before the assembled lords at Westminster Hall in January 1327, as his father's crown was placed upon his head, by men who had just destroyed his father's reign. Around him stood his mother Isabella, the she-wolf of France, and her lover Roger Mortimer, who had engineered Edward II's downfall and now expected to rule England through the boy king. "I shall be a good king to my people," the young Edward declared, his voice barely carrying across the hall. Few could have imagined that this slender boy would become the most successful warrior king since his great-grandfather Edward I, or that his reign would launch England on a century-long struggle for the throne of France itself. For 3 years, Mortimer ruled as the power behind the throne, styling himself Earl of March and treating the royal treasury as his personal purse. He made peace with Scotland, the humiliating Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328, recognized Robert Bruce as an independent king, and returned the Stone of Scone to Scotland, the shameful peace the English called it, and young Edward III never forgot the humiliation, but Mortimer overplayed his hand. In 1330 he had Edmund, Earl of Kent, Edward II's half-brother, executed on trumped-up charges of treason. The judicial murder of a member of the royal family shocked even Mortimer's supporters and convinced Edward III that his own life might be in danger. The young king's coup was as swift as it was decisive. On October 19, 1330, while Mortimer and Isabella held court at Nottingham Castle, Edward and his supporters entered through a secret passage known only to a few trusted servants. They found Mortimer in the Queen Mother's chambers and dragged him away despite Isabella's desperate pleas. "Good son, have pity on the gentle Mortimer," Isabella cried, but Edward III was done with mercy. Mortimer was executed at Tyburn like a common criminal, his body hanging from the gallows for 2 days before being taken down for burial. Isabella was retired to comfortable captivity at Castle Rising, where she would live for nearly 30 years, a constant reminder of the price of political overreach. At 18, Edward III began his personal rule with a kingdom that had lost respect at home and abroad. Scotland was independent, France was hostile, and the English nobility was demoralized by decades of civil war and military defeat. But Edward possessed gifts that his father had lacked: military genius, political intelligence, and an understanding that successful kingship required both the respect of the nobility and the support of the commons. His court became a center of chivalric culture, where tournaments and feasts celebrated an idealized vision of knightly honor. In 1348, Edward founded the Order of the Garter, England's premier order of chivalry, with the motto, "Honi soit qui mal y pense," shame on him who thinks evil of it. Legend claims the motto originated when the Countess of Salisbury dropped her garter at a court dance, and Edward retrieved it while declaring that the garter would soon be held in high honor. More likely, the motto was Edward's response to critics who questioned his claim to the French throne, a claim that would dominate English foreign policy for over a century. Edward's assertion of his right to inherit the French crown through his mother Isabella seemed almost absurd when he first made it in 1337. The Capetian dynasty had ruled France for over 3 centuries, and Philip II of Valois was Philip III's nephew and the choice of the French nobility. But Edward's claim had a certain legal logic. If women could transmit claims they could not themselves exercise, then Edward, grandson of Philip IV through Isabella, had a stronger hereditary right than Philip VI. The fact that no woman had ever ruled France in her own right did not necessarily invalidate claims transmitted through the female line. More importantly, Edward's claim provided legal justification for a war that served English interests. The French had supported Scottish independence, harbored English political exiles, and threatened English possessions in Gascony. War might recover lost territories, unite the English nobility behind their king, and provide the plunder that medieval warfare promised to successful commanders. The 100 Years' War began not with great battles, but with economic warfare. Edward banned the export of English wool to Flanders, hoping to force the Flemish cloth towns to support his cause against their French overlord. When Philip VI responded by confiscating Edward's Gascon territories, the diplomatic niceties ended. "Philip of Valois, who calls himself King of France," Edward declared, "has usurped our realm and inheritance." The early campaigns were frustrating and expensive. Edward's Flemish allies proved unreliable. His treasury was strained to breaking point, and Philip VI avoided the decisive battle that might have settled the war quickly. Everything changed at Crécy in August 1346. Philip VI, confident in his numerical superiority, attacked Edward's carefully chosen position without waiting for his full army to assemble. What followed was a massacre that announced a revolution in medieval warfare. Edward's secret weapon was the English longbow, a 6-foot weapon that could drive a bodkin point through plate armor at 200 yards. His archers, drawn from the yeomanry of England and Wales, could loose 12 aimed shots per minute, a rate of fire that no crossbow could match. The French knights charged again and again, their horses screaming as they fell to English arrows. The cream of French chivalry, including John of Bohemia, the blind king who had asked to be led into battle one last time, died in the mud before the English positions. The archers let fly their arrows so wholly together and so thick that it seemed like snow, wrote chronicler Jean Froissart. King Philip fled the field with a handful of survivors, his royal banner trampled in the dirt. His son, the future John II, was wounded and barely escaped capture. The myth of French military supremacy, built over centuries, died at Crécy in a single afternoon. But even Crécy paled beside the Black Prince's victory at Poitiers 10 years later. Edward of Woodstock, called the Black Prince for his dark armor, was campaigning in southern France when he found himself trapped by King John II with a French army 3 times the size of his own. The Battle of Poitiers on September 19, 1356, was fought on ground so broken that the French cavalry could not charge effectively. Once again, English longbowmen decimated the French ranks, while the prince's tactical genius turned a desperate defensive action into complete victory. King John II of France was captured along with his youngest son Philip, 17 dukes and counts and thousands of knights. The ransom demanded for the French king, 3 million gold écus, was more than France's annual revenue. Fortune has turned her wheel, the Black Prince reportedly told his royal prisoner. Today you are my guest. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 seemed to end the war on terms that exceeded Edward III's wildest dreams. France would pay John II's ransom, cede vast territories in southwestern France to England, and recognize English sovereignty over these lands. In return, Edward would renounce his claim to the French throne. But the treaty contained the seeds of its own destruction. The territorial cessions were so extensive that they would have reduced France to a rump state around Paris. French national sentiment, awakened by decades of English invasion, would never accept such humiliation. The war resumed in 1369 under the brilliant French commander Bertrand du Guesclin, who understood that France could not defeat England in pitched battle, but might wear down English strength through attrition. His strategy of avoiding major engagements while recapturing isolated English garrisons proved devastatingly effective. By the time Edward III died in 1377, most of the Bretigny gains had been lost. The Black Prince had died the previous year, worn out by disease contracted during his Spanish campaigns. The old king's last years were marked by senility, corruption, and the growing influence of his grasping mistress Alice Pereire. The king that was so noble and so dreaded through all the world, lamented Froissart, was at the end so aged that nature failed in him. The crown passed to Richard II, the Black Prince's 10-year-old son, beginning another minority that would test England's political stability. The Regency government, dominated by Edward III's surviving sons John of Gaunt and Thomas of Woodstock, struggled with the financial crisis left by decades of continental warfare. The poll taxes imposed to fund the French war fell most heavily on the peasantry, who had already been devastated by the Black Death of 1348–49. The plague had killed perhaps a third of England's population, creating a labor shortage that allowed surviving peasants to demand higher wages and better conditions. The Statute of Laborers, passed in 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but economic forces proved stronger than royal legislation. Peasants fled their manors to seek better conditions elsewhere, while landlords competed for scarce workers by offering improved terms. Social tensions exploded in 1381 with the Peasants' Revolt, the first great popular uprising in English history. Led by Wat Tyler, a Kentish artisan, and inspired by the radical priest John Ball, the rebels marched on London demanding the abolition of serfdom and the reduction of taxes. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? Ball preached to enthusiastic crowds. The 14-year-old Richard II showed remarkable courage in confronting the rebels at Mile End and Smithfield. When Wat Tyler was killed during negotiations, struck down by the Lord Mayor of London in a moment of confusion, Richard took control of the situation. "I am your king," he told the leaderless rebels. "Follow me, and I will give you what you desire." Richard's promises ended the immediate crisis, but they were quickly broken once the rebels had dispersed. The peasants' revolt failed in its immediate objectives, but it marked a permanent change in English society. The days when peasants would meekly accept whatever conditions their betters imposed were ending. Richard II's personal rule, which began in earnest after 1389, revealed a king of considerable intelligence and artistic sensitivity, but little political wisdom. His court became a center of literary culture. Geoffrey Chaucer served as a royal retainer, but Richard's autocratic tendencies and his reliance on unpopular favorites created dangerous opposition. The crisis came in 1386, when Parliament, led by Richard's uncle Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, demanded the dismissal of the king's ministers and the reform of royal government. The merciless Parliament of 1388 impeached Richard's supporters and executed several of his closest advisors. Richard submitted for the moment, but he never forgave the humiliation. In 1397, he struck back with characteristic ruthlessness. Gloucester was arrested and died mysteriously in captivity at Calais, almost certainly murdered on Richard's orders. The other leaders of the baronial opposition were exiled or executed. "Now Richard is king indeed," one chronicler observed with dark irony. But Richard's revenge created more enemies than it destroyed. When he exiled Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Herefordshire and son of John of Gaunt in 1398, he made a fatal error. Bolingbroke was popular, wealthy, and had strong claims to the throne through his descent from Edward III. Richard's decision to confiscate Bolingbroke's inheritance when John of Gaunt died in 1399 provided the pretext for rebellion. While Richard campaigned in Ireland, Bolingbroke landed in Yorkshire, claiming only his rightful inheritance. "I come for what is mine by right," Bolingbroke declared, but few believed he would stop at recovering his duchy. Richard's support collapsed with stunning speed. The nobility, alienated by years of tyranny, flocked to Bolingbroke's banner. When Richard returned from Ireland, he found himself friendless and defenced. The deposition of Richard II in September 1399 was managed with constitutional care. Parliament was summoned to hear charges against the king: tyranny, violation of his coronation oath, incompetence in government. Richard was persuaded to abdicate voluntarily, allowing Bolingbroke to claim the throne as Henry IV. But constitutional niceties could not disguise the brutal reality. Richard II was the Lord's anointed, chosen by God and crowned in Westminster Abbey. His deposition shattered the mystique of sacred kingship and opened questions about royal legitimacy that would haunt England for centuries. Richard died at Pontefract Castle in February 1400, officially of natural causes but almost certainly murdered. His death was politically necessary. A deposed king remained a focus for opposition, but it stained Henry IV's reign with the blood of regicide. The 100 Years' War had begun with Edward III's claim to rule France by divine right. It ended the 14th century with divine right itself in question, as an English king lay dead in a Yorkshire castle, victim of subjects who had decided that crowns could be won and lost by force of arms. The ghost of Richard II haunted Pontefract Castle on a cold February night in 1400, as Henry IV, newly crowned and deeply troubled, stood over the body of his predecessor. The official cause of death was recorded as natural illness, but everyone knew the truth. The last Plantagenet king had been murdered, and with his death, the age of unquestioned royal authority died too. "The blood of kings," Henry's confessor reportedly warned him, "cries out for vengeance from the grave." And indeed, Henry IV's reign would be tormented by rebellions, conspiracies, and the constant fear that divine judgment was upon him for his usurpation of the throne. The curse of Pontefract, for so men called it, would shadow the House of Lancaster for 60 years, until another usurper's sword ended the dynasty in blood. Henry had claimed the throne as the rightful heir of Edward III, but his hereditary claim was weaker than that of Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March, who descended from Edward's second son through the female line. Henry's real title to rule was Conquest, disguised by parliamentary approval and constitutional forms that fooled no one. The weakness of his position became apparent almost immediately. In 1400, Owain Glyndwr, a Welsh gentleman with royal blood, raised the banner of Welsh independence, proclaiming himself Prince of Wales by ancient right. What began as a local dispute over land escalated into a national uprising that would consume Wales for 15 years. Glyndwr was no ordinary rebel. Educated at Oxford and trained in English law, he combined Welsh nationalism with sophisticated military and diplomatic strategy. His alliance with Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, and Edmund Mortimer threatened to tear England apart. "I can call spirits from the vasty deep," Glyndwr boasted. According to Shakespeare's later dramatization, and indeed he seemed to command supernatural powers of survival and resistance. The Percy Rebellion of 1403 brought Henry IV closer to disaster than any English king since Stephen. Harry Hotspur, the legendary warrior who had won fame fighting the Scots, turned against the king who had once been his ally, claiming that Henry had broken faith with those who had helped him gain the throne. At Shrewsbury in July 1403, Henry faced his greatest test. The royal army met the rebels on open ground, king against earl, son against father. Prince Henry, the future Henry V, fought beside his father despite a severe wound that nearly killed him when an arrow pierced his face. Hotspur's death in the thick of the fighting ended the rebellion, but at a terrible cost. The flower of English chivalry lay scattered across Shrewsbury Field, and the kingdom had come within a stroke of civil war. "This realm bleeds from wounds that will not heal," lamented one contemporary chronicler. The victory at Shrewsbury secured Henry's throne but could not heal his conscience. In his later years, the king was tormented by a wasting disease that contemporaries saw as divine punishment for regicide. He suffered from what appears to have been psoriasis or possibly leprosy, his skin erupting in sores that no physician could cure. "God strikes him for his sins," whispered court gossips, noting how Henry would pray for hours in private chapels, seeking absolution that never seemed to come. He died in March 1413 at Westminster Abbey, reportedly in the Jerusalem chamber, fulfilling a prophecy that he would die in Jerusalem, though not the one he had expected. His son Henry V inherited a kingdom still scarred by rebellion, but united by the promise of renewed war with France. Henry V was everything his father was not, confident where Henry IV was anxious, decisive where the old king had been hesitant, blessed with the charisma that could make men follow him to death itself. Tall, athletic, and conventionally handsome, he looked like a king from the pages of romance. But beneath the chivalric exterior lay a mind of cold calculation. Henry understood that foreign war was the best cure for domestic division, that nothing would unite the English nobility like the prospect of French plunder and glory. We happy few, we band of brothers," Shakespeare would later have him say before Agincourt, capturing the spirit if not the exact words of a king who understood the power of inspiring rhetoric. Henry's renewal of the 100 Years' War in 1415 seemed almost inevitable, given the chaos into which France had fallen. The mad King Charles VI alternated between periods of lucidity and episodes when he believed he was made of glass and might shatter if touched. His kingdom was torn between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions, each seeking to control the royal person and exclude their rivals from power. Henry's first campaign culminated in the siege of Harfleur, a strategic port at the mouth of the Seine that would provide a base for further operations. But the siege lasted longer than expected, and by October 1415, Henry's army was decimated by disease and exhaustion. The march to Calais that followed was intended as a fighting withdrawal, not a quest for battle. Henry had perhaps 6,000 men, many of them sick and demoralized. The French army that intercepted him at Agincourt numbered at least 20,000, including the flower of French chivalry. What happened on October 25, 1415, defied all military logic. The French cavalry, charging across muddy ground churned by recent rains, became trapped in a killing ground between the English flanks. Henry's longbowmen, protected by sharpened stakes, slaughtered horses and riders with methodical efficiency. When the French second line advanced on foot, they found themselves struggling through mud littered with the bodies of the first attack. English men-at-arms, fighting with the desperate courage of cornered wolves, hacked down French nobles who could barely move in their heavy armor. The massacre was so complete that Henry ordered the killing of French prisoners, a decision that shocked contemporary chivalric sensibilities, but ensured that captured French nobles could not rejoin the battle if it turned against the English. God fought for England this day, Henry declared, and few who witnessed Agincourt doubted divine intervention in the victory. But Agincourt, for all its glory, was only the beginning of Henry's conquest of France. His systematic conquest of Normandy between 1417 and 1419 was a masterpiece of medieval warfare, methodical, thorough, and devastatingly effective. The siege of Rouen in 1418–19 revealed both Henry's military genius and his ruthless pragmatism. When the city's defenders expelled non-combatants to preserve food supplies, Henry refused to allow them through English lines. Thousands of civilians, men, women, and children, died in the ditches between the walls and the English siege lines. "This is war," Henry reportedly told critics, "not a tournament." The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 seemed to crown Henry's achievements with permanent success. Charles VI acknowledged Henry as his heir, while the Dauphin Charles, the rightful heir by primogeniture, was declared illegitimate and disinherited. Henry married Charles VI's daughter Catherine, uniting the crowns of England and France in their future children. But Henry V's death at Bois de Vincennes in August 1422, possibly from dysentery, though poison was rumored, shattered the dream of dual monarchy. His heir was an infant, Henry VI barely 9 months old. Within weeks, Charles VI also died, leaving the kingdoms of England and France to be ruled by a baby who could not even speak. The minority of Henry VI exposed the fatal weakness in the Lancastrian position. English rule in France depended on constant military pressure backed by inexhaustible resources. A regency government, divided between competing factions and chronically short of money, could provide neither. John, Duke of Bedford, Henry VI's brother and regent in France, proved himself a capable commander and administrator. But he was fighting not just the armies of the Dauphin, but the awakening of French national consciousness, personified by a peasant girl from Domremy, who claimed divine visions. Joan of Arc appeared at the court of the Dauphin in 1429, claiming that the Archangel Michael had commanded her to drive the English from France and see Charles VII crowned at Reims Cathedral. To skeptics, she was a deluded peasant girl. To believers, she was the savior promised by ancient prophecies. Her relief of the Siege of Orleans in May 1429 marked the turning point of the 100 Years' War. The English, who had seemed invincible since Agincourt, found themselves retreating before a teenage girl who carried a banner declaring, "Jesus Mary," and claimed divine protection. "The maid has put courage into the French and fear into the English," wrote one contemporary observer, Jones. Capture by Burgundian allies of the English in 1430 should have ended the French revival, but her martyrdom at Rouen in 1431, burned as a heretic and witch by an English-sponsored ecclesiastical court, only strengthened French resolve. The girl who had lived for barely 19 years became a symbol of resistance that would outlast every English victory. Henry VI's personal rule, which began in earnest after 1437, revealed a king utterly unsuited to medieval monarchy. Pious, gentle, and scholarly, he was everything a saint should be and nothing a king required. His foundations of Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, showed his commitment to learning, but his inability to make hard decisions or inspire military loyalty proved catastrophic. By 1450, English power in France had collapsed everywhere except Calais. The Battle of Castillon in 1453, where English forces were destroyed by French artillery, marked the effective end of the 100 Years' War. 3 centuries of English dreams of continental empire died on that Gascon battlefield, but the loss of France was only the beginning of England's troubles. Henry VI's complete mental breakdown in 1453, he fell into a catatonic state that lasted over a year, created a power vacuum that his ambitious cousins were eager to fill. Richard, Duke of York, Henry's cousin and heir presumptive until the king's son Edward was born in 1453, had the strongest claim to rule as regent, but he was opposed by Queen Margaret of Anjou, the formidable French princess who refused to see her husband's authority diminished, or her son's inheritance threatened. The Wars of the Roses, so called because of the white rose badge of York and the red rose of Lancaster, though these symbols were largely invented by Tudor historians, began not as a dynastic struggle but as a dispute over who should govern an incapacitated king. The First Battle of St. Albans in May 1455 was little more than a street fight between rival retinues. lasting barely an hour and claiming fewer than 100 lives. But among the dead was Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, whose death created a blood feud between the great noble houses that would consume England for 30 years. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York, Shakespeare would later write, though the real Richard of York found little glory in the chaos that followed his victory. The conflict escalated when Queen Margaret, fearing for her son's inheritance, allied with the surviving Beaufort supporters and the Percy family of Northumberland. Her forces defeated York at Ludford Bridge in 1459, forcing him to flee to Ireland while his supporters sought refuge in Calais. But the Yorkists returned in 1460, with popular support and military experience gained in the French wars. Their victory at Northampton captured Henry VI himself, though the gentle king seemed barely aware of his changing circumstances. "I am your true king," he reportedly told his captors, "and I wish no harm to any man." York's decision to claim the throne by hereditary right, rather than merely seeking to govern as regent, transformed a political dispute into a dynastic war. His superior hereditary claim through descent from Edward III's second son was legally sound, but it threatened to overturn 60 years of Lancastrian rule. The compromise reached in Parliament, that Henry VI should remain king for life while York and his heirs would inherit the throne, satisfied no one. Queen Margaret would never accept her son's disinheritance, while York's supporters wondered why they should wait for their reward. The settlement collapsed within weeks. Margaret gathered a northern army of Scots and borderers who cared nothing for legal niceties and everything for plunder. At Wakefield in December 1460, York was killed in battle, his head displayed on the gates of York adorned with a paper crown in mockery of his royal pretensions. "Off with his head, and set it on York gates," Margaret reportedly commanded, so York may overlook the town of York. But York's death only transferred leadership of his cause to his eldest son Edward, Earl of March, a 19-year-old giant who combined his father's political ambition with military genius that recalled Edward III and Henry IV. Edward's victory at Mortimer's Cross in February 1461, fought beneath 3 sons, a parhelion that the Yorkists interpreted as divine approval, announced the arrival of a new kind of king. Where Henry VI was weak, Edward IV was strong. Where the Lancastrian court was dominated by foreigners and upstarts, Edward appealed to English nationalism and aristocratic values. His decisive victory at Towton in March 1461, fought in a blinding snowstorm that allowed his archers to outshoot their Lancastrian opponents, established the House of York on the throne. With perhaps 50,000 casualties, Towton was the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. "The blood of Englishmen flowed like rivers," recorded one chronicler, "and the snow was red from Saxon to Towton." Edward IV's first reign, 1461-70, seemed to mark the end of the civil wars. Henry VI was a prisoner, Queen Margaret was in exile, and the Yorkist triumph appeared complete. But Edward's secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville in 1464, a beautiful widow from a minor Lancastrian family, created new divisions within the Yorkist party. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker who had been instrumental in Edward's victory, expected to control royal policy through his influence over the young king. Edward's marriage to a woman Warwick considered beneath royal dignity, and his elevation of the Woodville family to high positions, convinced the Earl that he had made the wrong choice of king. Warwick's rebellion in 1469-70, supported by Edward's brother George, Duke of Clarence, briefly restored Henry VI to the throne. But Edward IV's return from Burgundian exile in 1471 proved that personal monarchy was stronger than factional politics. At Barnet, in April 1471, fought in thick fog that caused confusion in both armies. Warwick the Kingmaker was killed when his horse became trapped in marshy ground. The Earl who had made and unmade kings died, fighting on foot like a common soldier. "Here lies the proud setter-up and plucker down of kings," one chronicler wrote of Warwick's death. The final Lancastrian defeat came at Tewkesbury in May 1471, where Queen Margaret was captured, and her son Edward, Prince of Wales, was killed. Whether in battle or murdered afterward remains disputed. With the death of Henry VI in the Tower of London that same month, officially of melancholy but almost certainly murdered, the House of Lancaster was extinct in the male line. Edward IV's second reign, 1471-83, was one of the most successful in English history. Trade flourished, the nobility was tamed, and royal finances were restored through careful management and the profits of commerce. Edward became the first English king since Henry II to die solvent. But Edward's sudden death in April 1483, aged only 40, precipitated the final crisis of the Wars of the Roses. His heir was 12-year-old Edward V, requiring a regency that no one was powerful enough to control unopposed. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward IV's youngest brother and the most successful military commander of his generation, moved quickly to secure power. He arrested the leaders of the Woodville faction, took custody of the young king and his brother, and within weeks had persuaded Parliament to declare Edward IV's children illegitimate. The official justification was that Edward IV had been pre-contracted to marry Eleanor Butler before his wedding to Elizabeth Woodville, making his subsequent marriage invalid and his children bastards. Few believed this legal fiction, but it provided cover for what was obviously a usurpation. Richard III's coronation in July 1483 was magnificent, but his reign was doomed from its inception. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, created a mystery that has never been satisfactorily resolved and a scandal that fatally undermined Richard's legitimacy. Whether the princes died of natural causes, were murdered on Richard's orders, or were secretly removed from the Tower, their fate became a rallying cry for Richard's enemies. The man who had served Edward IV loyally for 12 years was transformed in popular imagination into a child-murdering tyrant. The most untrue creature living was how Richard described his enemies, but the accusation might equally have been turned against him. Henry Tudor's invasion of England in August 1485 should have been easily defeated. His claim to the throne was tenuous, descent from John of Gaunt through an illegitimate line later legitimized, and his military resources were minimal, but Richard III's support had been eroded by 2 years of rumors, rebellions, and the suspicion that he had murdered his nephews. When the royal and rebel armies met at Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485, many of Richard's supposed allies remained neutral or actively betrayed him. Richard's death in battle, the last English king to die fighting, ended the Plantagenet dynasty that had ruled England for over 3 centuries. His crown, reportedly found hanging on a hawthorn bush after the battle, was placed on Henry Tudor's head by Sir William Stanley. "God save King Henry," the victorious army cried, and with those words, the Tudor age began. But the Wars of the Roses had cost England more than a dynasty. The old nobility was decimated, royal authority had been fatally weakened by repeated depositions, and the mystique of sacred kingship had been shattered by decades of civil war. Henry VII would spend his reign rebuilding what the wars had destroyed, creating the foundations for the Renaissance monarchy that would make England a European power. But the blood spilled at Bosworth and the countless battles that preceded it had changed England forever. The age of medieval kingship was ending. The modern world was about to begin. As dawn broke over Bosworth Field on August 23, 1485, the last medieval king of England lay dead among the hawthorn bushes, his naked body slung across a pack-horse for the ignominious journey to Leicester. Richard III had died as he had lived his final years, fighting against impossible odds, betrayed by those who should have supported him, clinging to a crown that had become more curse than blessing. With his death, more than a dynasty ended. The England that William the Conqueror had carved from the Saxon kingdoms, that the Plantagenets had expanded into a European empire, that had survived plague, rebellion, and foreign invasion, was passing into history. The new king, Henry VII, would face different challenges than his medieval predecessors. Where they had ruled through personal relationships and feudal obligation, he would build a bureaucratic state. Where they had sought glory in foreign wars, he would pursue wealth through trade and diplomacy. Where they had been warriors first and administrators second, he would be a businessman who happened to wear a crown. The long night of medieval England was ending, but what stories it had told. We have walked with Saxon heroes like Alfred the Great, who built a kingdom from the marshes of Somerset. We have witnessed the Norman Revolution that transformed a conquered realm into the heart of a European empire. We have seen the glory of Plantagenet kings who dreamed of ruling from Scotland to Spain, and the tragedy of their descendants who lost everything in civil wars that consumed the flower of English chivalry. We have heard the clash of swords at Hastings and Crécy, Agincourt and Towton. We have listened to the prayers of saints like Thomas Becket and the curses of rebels like Simon de Montfort. We have felt the terror of the Black Death and the hope of peasants who dared to dream of freedom. This was an age when kings truly ruled, when a strong monarch could reshape his realm and a weak one could see it dissolve into chaos. It was a time when personal honor mattered more than political expediency, when men would die for abstract principles like feudal loyalty or dynastic legitimacy. But it was also an age of casual violence, systematic oppression, and grinding poverty for the vast majority of the population. The medieval world was beautiful and terrible, inspiring and horrifying, noble and brutal, often all at the same time. As you drift toward sleep, let the echoes of this vanished world carry you into dreams. Perhaps you will see the great cathedrals rising stone by stone, built by craftsmen whose names are forgotten but whose faith remains carved in every arch and buttress. Perhaps you will hear the thunder of heavy cavalry charging across English fields, or the whisper of monks copying manuscripts in scriptoriums lit by candle and oil lamp. Maybe you will dream of Eleanor of Aquitaine, the queen who outlived 10 children and 2 husbands, ruling her domains with intelligence and ruthless pragmatism, or of William Marshall, the greatest knight of his age, who served 5 kings with unwavering loyalty and died peacefully in his bed at 80 years old. You might find yourself in the court of Edward III, watching the flower of English chivalry feast and dance while planning new campaigns in France, or standing with Henry V before the walls of Harfleur, listening to him promise his soldiers that their names would be remembered from this day to the ending of the world. These were real people who lived and loved, fought and died, in a world so different from our own that it might as well be another planet. Yet their hopes and fears, their triumphs and tragedies, still speak to us across the centuries. Their England is gone forever, buried beneath the weight of history and change. But their stories remain, as vivid and compelling as the day they were first told around medieval hearth fires. Sleep well, and may your dreams carry you back to the age of kings and knights, of castles and cathedrals, of an England that existed long ago and far away, in the mists of medieval time. If this journey through medieval England moved you, if these stories of kings and queens, knights and peasants, saints and sinners have stirred something in your soul, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more historical adventures. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Which medieval monarch fascinated you most? Which battle made your heart race? Which tragedy made you pause and reflect? History is not just facts and dates, but the eternal human story of struggle and triumph, love and loss, hope and despair. In learning about our past, we better understand our present and perhaps glimpse our future. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with the echoes of history and the whispers of the ages.